I've been asked to speak today about whether meal timing influences energy expenditure and physical activity in particular. And I'll come back second to deal with physical activity separately. To start with the bigger question about energy expenditure, I'd like to first think about the other components of energy expenditure, which sum to give our total energy expenditure. So those other than physical movement or physical activity would be dietary induced thermogenesis and resting metabolic rate. So as the name suggests, diet induced thermogenesis is a no-brainer that it's diet induced. So we know full well that diet has an influence on diet induced thermogenesis, or DIT. And what this means is any of the energy necessarily expended or invested in processing foods after you eat. So of course, if you choose to eat or not is a clear influence there. If you don't eat, there will be no DIT by definition. And how much you eat will then proportionately correspond to how much your energy expenditure is accelerated to process foods. And we also know that the types of foods that you choose to eat or not to eat will have an influence, with fat, for example, requiring very little investment of energy to derive the calories or energy from that food. And then protein and alcohol, particularly if you drink the alcohol rapidly, results in a much higher DIT. So that acute and direct effect of food on DIT is probably the easiest one to give evidence right away that meal timing and when we eat, which means whether we've eaten, is going to have an effect on energy expenditure. And then similarly, we don't see such an acute effect directly on resting metabolic rate, but certainly if you have adjusted your diet long term and when you eat might have resulted in some energy restriction, there is this concept of adaptive thermogenesis, which I wouldn't strictly say is a component of energy expenditure because it doesn't sum with the others to give total energy expenditure. But adaptive thermogenesis describes the way that your resting metabolism, and with that I would include then DIT, can be modified. So certain facultative processes that can be increased or decreased and are not absolutely obligatory for survival can be accelerated or decelerated. And in particular, this has been evidenced in animals. Certainly other species have far more capacity to upregulate or downregulate metabolism as a requirement for body heat or certainly for overfeeding or underfeeding. But humans do have some capacity, some limited capacity for that. So on those first two fronts then, we know that resting metabolic rate and your diet-induced thermogenic effect of food can be modified by the presence of food, and therefore when we eat or if we choose to eat at different times of day could directly influence those. Of course though, those two effects are somewhat predictable and also very small, and you could argue therefore negligible for changes in body weight, whereas a much more profound effect what we can find is from the effects on physical activity. So when we start to look at energy expenditure above the resting levels or basal metabolism and then the response to feeding, we're getting into physical activity thermogenesis. And I'd like to break that down into two ways that meal timing could affect it. And the first is metabolic. So if we talk about a fixed amount of movement or energy expended work, could we adjust the energy expended for that amount of work through some metabolic adjustment or efficiency? And then the final thing I'll talk about is the behavioural aspect of that, and do we then choose to do more? So thinking about this metabolic efficiency or the metabolic effect, if we take a given level of work, whether that's resting energy expenditure or just your day-to-day activities, we know that those kind of movements are going to be fueled in humans largely through a mixture of carbohydrate and fat or lipid oxidation. A very negligible amount of protein used to support our daily activities. And we know that the amount of carbohydrate and fat that is used, that mixture, is going to be dictated by a number of factors related to the intensity of the activity and so on. But whether we eat and what we eat, which is therefore determined by the timing of those nutrients, is going to dictate that mixture, both acutely. So we know if we eat carbohydrates, eat a regular meal with carbohydrates in it, then we're going to increase our carbohydrate oxidation. And indeed, if we have a more sustained chronic diet where we have modified our bodily nutrient status, perhaps depleting endogenous carbohydrates in the liver and the muscle, then that likewise, when we then exercise later, could modify our preference for carbohydrate or fat. And we tend to see in the literature this citation of an RQ, or a respiratory exchange ratio, of 0.85, which is sometimes described as using the same amount of carbohydrate and fat, which isn't strictly true. It's actually that you're deriving the same amount of energy from carbohydrate and fat, which by definition means you must be using a greater amount or mass of carbohydrate. But a lot of the techniques we'll come back to in the measurement here will sometimes assume then that we are using a similar amount of carbohydrate and fat to at least to derive our energy. And so we can modify that by whether we've eaten and when we've eaten, could determine a greater amount of fat or carbohydrate usage. And the relevance here to metabolic efficiency is that we do know that carbohydrate is marginally more efficient than fat. So if we're going to do this same amount of external work, whether that's physical movement or not, then you could potentially expend fewer calories doing that, or certainly consume less oxygen in doing that, which can have implications for some of the measurements we make. So I think that metabolic efficiency can somewhat come under the same heading as our look at diet-induced thermogenesis and resting metabolic rate, in that these are relatively small and relatively predictable changes in energy expenditure that arguably then may not culminate in being sufficient to account for a change in body mass, or a relevant quantitative change at least to explain the obesity epidemic or to use for weight loss. Which brings me to the last point then, which is to think about the behavioural response to when we eat. And that has much more capacity to affect than energy expenditure. Physical activity energy expenditure is undoubtedly the most variable component of energy expenditure, and the most malleable for that reason. We can implement interventions to result in dramatic differences in physical activity levels and movement that we just simply can't do by trying to accelerate resting metabolism or even fed state resting metabolism. And so to look at that behavioural compensation and whether meal timing affects physical activity in terms of how much we move around and what we do, I'd like to break that down for the remainder of this talk into really three aspects. And one is the philosophy behind that, what we might expect, what should happen when we change food availability over time. The second would be to actually look at some of the evidence that we have on this now, and that leads us to talk about measurement issues. And then lastly would be to think about the mechanisms, because if we can understand how those changes that I'll show you are happening, then we could perhaps better take advantage of them and target physical activity to try and compensate for diet or not, as we would like to lose weight or maintain weight. So to start with the kind of philosophical perspective, I think you could come up with a good rationale that when we eat, and so if we choose not to eat, could that result in an increase in energy expenditure or in a decrease? So if we wanted to come up with an evolutionary rationale perhaps for why energy expenditure might increase, you could argue then that within nature, if there is limited resources in an area, say there's a famine, then sitting around waiting for the delivery van to come, it has not been driven into our nature. And so perhaps a more proactive strategy of going to seek food and exhibit scavenging behaviour could well be a legitimate response to food restriction, or choosing not to eat at a given period of the day or over many days. And that's not just a theoretical rationale, but we could see some evidence for that in terms of how there's evidence of starvation-induced hyperactivity, at least in rodents, and then some connections to that in human literature related to anorexia, although the findings are less clear there. I think we get a less clear picture of that response. And we have to remember then that if we're trying to extrapolate that animal data to humans, we have to remember the interspecies differences. And a lot of the data in rodents, we know that these animals eat pretty much continuously around a 24-hour cycle. And they have a relatively high resting metabolic rate and surface area to lose heat from relative to their body mass. So it really explains why these smaller animals have a really relentless need to eat continuously and drive energy through their relatively large splanchnic organs. And so perhaps it's understandable why an animal like that will go bananas and seek food as soon as there's a restriction of food, whereas humans are arguably better designed to deal with intermittent food availability, and we've evolved to manage with periods without food. So that would lead to the other possible hypothesis then, would be that with food restriction, perhaps the natural human response would be to restrict energy expenditure and in that way defend against a negative energy balance. And that leads us into looking at the evidence. And evidence for either of those hypotheses is sparse, mainly because so few studies have properly measured energy expenditure through physical activity. Many cross-sectional surveys, some have detected just using a survey changes in energy expenditure, but the problem here is that these will be subtle differences. Asking someone whether they've been to the gym is not going to reveal an effect of meal timing on their physical activity. Metabolic chambers or respiratory tanks are useful to very accurately gauge energy expenditure, but we haven't got the ecological validity there. Even the larger tanks are not going to allow you to exhibit your free living activity levels. For free living energy expenditure, doubly labelled water is often heralded as the gold standard, and it is a wonderful tool to look at total energy expenditure, but there are just a couple of issues that we have to consider there. I'll give 3 comments on that now. I mean, one is that we're seeing total energy expenditure, and there is an idea of this constrained model of metabolic rate, that if then physical activity and movement was increased, we might actually just be being more efficient in those other adaptive elements I mentioned earlier. The second point on that is that we actually have to assume the RQ or the RER is 0.85, which I mentioned earlier. So we assume an equal contribution to energy expenditure of carbohydrate and fat, which clearly if we're undergoing prolonged periods of fasting, and especially if that's resulting in changes in energy expenditure overall and activity, perhaps that may not hold. So that could be a small adjustment we need to think about. And then lastly, we don't get any information with the doubly labelled water technique about the patterns of activity, when changes occurred, were these during the fasting periods or the fed periods, and clearly when we eat brings in considerations about the temporal pattern of food intake, and so we need to know the temporal pattern of energy expenditure to attribute causality. And the intensity of those activities too, I think, is relevant there. So that brings me on to then just the last minute or two for the kind of evidence we've collected at Bath and that others have now collected, looking at meal timing and objectively measured physical activity. We've used the ActiHeart monitors, which combine heart rate and accelerometry and have been particularly validated for this kind of low-level activity, which is the kind of spontaneous or subconscious lifestyle activity which we had hypothesized would respond to periods without food. One study we conducted at Bath was the Bath Breakfast Project, which, despite its name, the breakfast for me was really the control group. I was interested in morning fasting, and we showed in that study that by fasting 0 calories every day until midday for 6 weeks, our fasting group were expending far fewer calories than the group who were prescribed breakfast each day. And as I mentioned, with the ActiHeart monitor, we get the temporal pattern there. So we know that that was particularly during the mornings when the food was withheld. is when that total daily energy expenditure differed between groups. And in that study, we showed a difference between groups of 450 calories per day. So this is clearly a more meaningful amount of energy expenditure, which could quantitatively be relevant to weight change, which I know is being covered in a separate talk in this series about the effects of meal timing on weight change. And so we've now seen that in our studies where we've withheld breakfast. The group at Leeds with Christine Bolio has shown similar, so we now know that that's been replicated in other groups. We've shown that in obese and lean populations, and actually our current data that we have under review has looked at that in relation to alternate day fasting. And so we know now that that effect is not just specific to the morning, and that even if you withhold food later in the day, which is relevant to the current thinking about early time restricted feeding, you can also restrict your energy expenditure through moving around less. So I think that's a lot of kind of data that's suggesting that meal timing when we eat can affect energy expenditure. And the very last thing to say then is that the mechanism, what is the mechanism through which that may occur? And frankly, I just don't think we know. In our studies, we've shown that the periods when participants were fasting and inactive corresponded to lower average glucose concentrations. Using continuous glucose monitors, we demonstrated that. So you might hypothesize that there is a direct connection there, whereby if you're not eating, your glucose is lower, and it's that availability of systemic carbohydrate that limits activity. Although there was a nice study from the Ian MacDonald's group in Nottingham from 2008 that demonstrated that when people report having a hypoglycemic attack and feeling lethargic, in fact that lethargy is not correlated with levels of blood glucose. So there may be a more complex picture, but at the moment I think more studies need to consider and measure energy expenditure using objective methods in response to dietary interventions, including when we eat, and then we might be able to establish those mechanisms. So thank you for your attention, and I hope that was interesting.